Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Napoleon, and today we're back with another Enlisted video, and today we're going to be talking about American heavy tanks. Because as of right now, America does not have any heavy tanks, so in today's video we're going to be doing a video about that. Of course, this video has been made possible for friends at Discord, meaning if you haven't liked, subscribed, or joined the Discord, highly suggest that you do, but that said, let's get started. Now, before we go even into the heavy tanks, we have to talk about the pre-war heavy tanks, and that is going to be the M6A1. Now, this thing, before World War II broke out, was developed limitedly by the United States as a means of a military progress with very few tanks, so development hastened, and then, because of the war, tanks such as the M3 and the M4 came online. On May 20th, 1940, the United States Ordnance Program began to work with a 50-ton heavy tank for their army. Initially, it was going to have multiple turret designs, 2 turrets, 75mm gun, 1 secondary turret, and a 37mm gun with a coaxial machine gun, and moved to a 25 and 20mm gun with a coaxial, plus 4 30 cals, and then put on a ball mount on the front glacis and the front rear of the turret. The project was then approved, somehow, in July of 11th, 1940, and then moved as a heavy tank of the T-1. However, similar concepts in Europe, such as the Soviet T-35 and German tanks, were falling out of favor due to a lack of combat effectiveness and very poor, should I say, performance. Hence, the United States did the same in October, so the design was changed. The current tank has 1 turret with a 7.6mm gun alongside of a 37 coaxial machine gun. Wait, take that back. Coaxial 37mm gun. The turret housed 3 crew members and a power by electrical transfer system. The commander's cupola was then copied from the M3 Lee, featuring a hatch to a machine gun, 2 50 cals to be exact, of which they were produced in the bow mount, and then 2 30 cal machine guns were then fixed by the driver. The entire tank has 6 crew members: the commander, the gun, driver assistant, loader, and loader number 2. After the construction of the vehicle was feasible, the engine and design was not powerful enough to power the tank heavy weight, and the weight in question is 57 tons. In 1941 to 1943, 3 prototypes were constructed with different transmissions, one with electrical, the rest with converter. The one with the converters was then designed as the M6 and the M6A1, designed from a hull-wielded construction. The electric transmission, designated as the M6A2, was never approved by the Ordnance Board, but it was manufactured anyway. It was hoped that 115 of these tanks could be built and tested in production in the start of December 1942 with designs. The commander's cupola also featured a regular hatch regarding the machine gun, and some things were changed here and there before the production, but by the M6 was ready for production, the army was moving forward vastly interested and waned in these heavy tanks, which translates to that they were not interested anymore. Of course they wouldn't, because the design had a lot of flaws. And they were more interested with the M4's performance in the war. Of course, the M4 had issues, but potentially it didn't have as big of an issue as the M6. The M6 was only slightly bigger than the Sherman, which was one of the big reasons, and the 3-inch gun didn't offer much improvement over the 75. And in the early 1940s too, the production was set for $250 a month, and then was closed down in September, which means this thing wasn't really useful. By the end of 1942, the Sherman's performance in its war had played such a good role and more adequate than the M6 heavy tank, whereas the remaining cheaper and lighter transporting for supply. This caused the M6 production to lower just to more than 40, before being completely shut down. After testing, a 90mm gun found on the M6 proved to be a good mount, but the poor layout of the tank of restriction, and the project was once again shut down. And in August of 1944, the Ordnance planned to modify some of the N6 heavy tanks with more armor and heavier armament to breach frontal areas. These were the M6A2E1 and the weight of the 77 tons and 190 frontal armor with the 105mm gun. Eisenhower then rejected these plans, stating it was impractical, and cancelled it. The M6 was found obsolete by December of 1944, with only 40 units produced and never seen action. Good thing it didn't. It only served as a propaganda piece during the war and was scrapped after all of them were scrapped, and except for one, which was on display in Maryland in the United States Army Ordnance Museum. During that development, the M6 turret was also modified to become the turret of the M10 tank destroyer. That said, That is the M6 for you, M6A1 to be exact, and honestly I do not like this design and it only work well in game. But that's it, let's move on to the M4A3E2 76W. Well, guess what you know? This is essentially a 76mm gun on a jumbo. And is there anything else I should talk about? Not really, except for the fact that it was slightly modified. But that said, let's move on to the next one. And these are gonna be the M26, or better known to you and me as the Pershing. The development of this tank was traced back to the number of tanks prototypes developed in spring of 1942 as a replacement for the M4 Sherman. One of these prototypes was a T-20 medium tank, which was heavily armored than the Sherman. This would eventually develop into the T-22 and T-23 designs with different transmission, all of which were in the rear of the vehicle instead of the front like the Shermans. These designs were comparable to the T-34-85 but were never quickly adopted as the M4, as the M4 performed very well in combat in Africa and Italy. Development continued with different interests in 1944, starting around the concept to mount a 90mm gun to fight the heavily armored German tanks and fortifications in Europe. This was the T-25 series with a upgunned T-23 with a 90mm gun, but also designed as bigger and more thickness than the T-26. The design held the 90mm gun and frontal armor of 110, of which it was sloped. However, the design had a weight of 40 tons, which increased its mobility and durability to use this old Sherman engines, meaning it was heavier, which means although it could still use the old Sherman engines, it was slower. Although starting with an electric drive, the design too proved complicated in the field use and then was replaced by the T-26E1. The design was finalized by the T-26E3 and became the production variant of the T-26E1, which production started in November of 1944, of which 10 were being produced. The reason why the M26 Pershing was delayed since the T-20 program brought up much controversy is the fact that the Pershings did not get into combat faster, or the combination of the tank destroyer doctrine, logistics, and other stuff. The tank destroyer doctrine dictated that tank destroyers were the primary anti-tank focus, while the armored vehicles were support infantry, so the tank firepower against other tanks was not prioritized, leading to a lot of opposition from the Ordnance Board. The development of the the M26 Pershing, called the T-26E3 at the time, was not formally adopted in Europe until the Zebra mission headed by General Barnes. The Zebra mission was formed under combat evaluation of the M26 tanks in Europe. In January of 1945, the shipment of M26 was deployed in December of 1944, arrived in Antwerp with only 20 tanks. The first tanks arrived in Paris in February 1945 with General Barnes and a few high-ranking officers from the tank Automotive Command, Ground Forces, and Arnhem Proving Grounds. Civilians also arrived with fish tankers to help, and General Eisenhower himself assigned the M26s to the 12th Army Group under Omar Bradley, who sent them to the 1st Army, splitting along the 3rd and the 9th Armored Divisions, where it did perform pretty well. Of course, it could still be knocked out by the Tigers, but it did consistently better jobs against Tigers, and when I mean Tigers, I mean them head on. Around March 6th, the Pershing led by Captain Gray was ambushed by a Nashorn, penetrating the Federal armor. The crew survived, but the Pershing became one of the only loss of the unit out of 20, so during the entire war, they only lost one. Same day, Pershings from E Company also took out a lot of German tanks. Needless to say, it was also sent to the Pacific. That said, that is all for the M26 Pershing. It was also seen service after the war, in the Korean War, and etc. But I'm not going to talk about that, because we do have one last tank on the list, and that is the M26E11. Or should I say, the Super Pershing. The M26 Pershing helped the American forces win the war, blah 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 blah, like I just said. And the upgraded version of the T-26E11 was then developed to give it even better performance, since it was shown that the 8.8cm KWK-43 cannon on the Tiger II could actually penetrate the Pershing. Hence, they need to up-armor the Pershing. The length of the T-15E gun barrel caused the manufacturer a very prominent counterbalance to the mantlet, meaning that this thing had to do some revising. In March 1945, following the Arbiton test, the T-25 mounted the T-15 gun, classified as the T-26E4. The plan was for 1,000 units, of course that would be never met, Along troops, the T-26E11 was known as the Super Pershing compared to normal M26 Pershing. The M26-11 Pershing was then sent to Europe and arrived in 15th of March 1945 inside the 3rd Armor. And it was introduced as a Super Pershing with additional armor to keep up to date with heavier German tanks. And you might be wondering, why was it called the Super Pershing? It was because of the fact that the front armor had 2 pieces of metal welded into it, each 37mm thick, with a space between the metals. Meaning, if a round come through, it will either detonate or be greatly diminished in terms of penetration once it reached the second layer. Not to mention the fact that the thing inside the space would also stop the gun itself. The metal pieces were sloped and the hull better was over. Said pieces were wielded on the turret mantlet and was taken from the Panther turret, about 80mm thick, and was wielded on the turret, hence the Super Pershing. Mentions of 3 prominent actions with the T-26E11, each one with destroying enemy tanks with little difficulty. Records shown at the Super Pershing destroyed a total of 3 tanks and captured 1 after an extended firefight. That's all. Let's move on to the last tank on our list, and that is the M4A3-105. This was essentially an upgun Sherman with a 105mm gun. Is there anything else that you need to know? Not really, because this video is long enough. Needless to say, this thing has been upgunned to a 105mm gun, and there was a lot of them at the end of the war. About 4,680. But that's it, that's all it for this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the Discord. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.